Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, so thank you all for being here. I know I'm the last one, so you might be anxious to get home, but I'll take about 20 minutes of your time this afternoon to talk to you about Acadian identity. Pardon me. In his introduction to Antonine Maillet's play Evangeline 2, Henri-Paul Jacques writes that, sorry, I'm just moving something around. La parole est le traversier par excellence. Traversier, which means ferry, and the action of traverser, which means to go across, come from the play in which the eponymous character travels across. She travels both literally in her many street crossings to and from the park, and figuratively, both in the play's intertextual crossings as a riff on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie, and intralingual crossing as the use of the word traversier rather than traversier, that is in the Acadian phonetic spelling rather than in the standard French shows. But the idea of traverser, or of traveling across, also provides a productive framework from which to approach my topic today. And I want to explore the question of expressions of identity in contemporary Acadian translations, and more specifically to determine whether patterns today correspond to challenges of monolithic and stagnant identity myths found in late 20th century translations. So Antonine Maillet, who is the playwright of Evangeline 2, she's also Acadie's most prolific translator. So I'll start with her and with a summary of findings from some previous research that I've done. Specifically, I'll look at mechanisms established by her in her 1993 translation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. And then I'll identify similar aspects of language, imagery, and strategy in two translations from 2020 of works by Nova Scotian writers. There's Amy McKay's novel, The Birth House, translated as La Coucheuse de Scott's Bay by Sonia Malabalza, and Sue Goyette's poetry collection, Ocean, translated as Océan by Jojet Leblanc. And finally, I'll interpret these findings according to Nicole Nolette's framework of traduction ludique, or playful translation. Before I go on, though, I want to provide a bit of context so that you know what I'm talking about. All of the translators that I'll be mentioning today identify as Acadian, and they base their creative and translation projects in that cultural space. So Acadians are descendants of French settlers who established a colony in present-day Nova Scotia on Canada's Atlantic coast in the early 17th century. It's not a legal boundary, but it's a cultural identity with distinct vernaculars that live on to this day. And one important historical fact that I want to mention, because it will come up again in my talk, is the Grand Dérangement, or the deportation. So from 1755 to 1763, the Acadians were deported from the lands on which they were living by British colonial officials, and this really shaped the Acadian collective imagination and consciousness. And the second thing I want to talk about is just give a bit of context around Evangeline. You can see her statue there in front of the Memorial Church, but she's the eponymous character of an epic poem by an American poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that was published in 1847. It was a huge success at the time, and it's been translated more than 130 times, including into a French version by a Québécois poet named Pamphile Lemay in 1864. And that's how she arrived in Acadie, in French-speaking Acadie. So she arrived in translation in French, and she arrived at the perfect time, just as the Acadian Renaissance of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s was happening. And that's how she came to really supply Acadie with its national epic. And she provided the narrative of the Grand Dérangement that I mentioned earlier, that the Acadian consciousness until then had forgotten, or at least had remained silent about due to the trauma of the event. But the problem is that the poem is grounded in values of traditionalism and victimhood embodied by Evangeline. And while it was useful for the clerico-nationalist ideology at the time, she's a little bit passé now, and she's become the basis for lingering monolithic identity myths that, as this paper questions, translators could potentially be contesting through their work. So in terms of patterns of identity in Antonine Maillet's translations, I promised that I'd provide an example from her translation of The Tempest. And this is research that I did for my MPhil dissertation a few years ago. So Antonine Maillet, she was born in Acadie, but moved to Montreal, Quebec early in her writing career. And that's where she began her translation practice. Her 14 translations for the theater were produced and published in Montreal between 1978 and 1999. And that's a period that partly coincides with the one covered in Annie Brisset's seminal study, A Sociocritique of Translation, that came out in French in the early 90s and in English translation in 96. So for anyone familiar with that work, you can situate yourself a little bit. But what I identified as part of my master's dissertation were fundamental differences between Maillet's translations of Shakespeare and those of her Québécois counterparts. And my research showed that Maillet participated in a similar identity-forming discourse, but one that revolved specifically around Acadian identity while translating for a non-Acadian theater audience. So by doing that, I challenged some of Brisset's incorporation of Maillet's work in her own study. But this gives, it creates a translational practice for Maillet that creates effects such as this one. And what I want to show here is an example of Maillet writing the grand dérangement into her translation, where it wasn't necessarily there in the source text. So first in pink, you can see that what was a hint in Shakespeare has become a full récit or narrative in Maillet's translation. And to me, that suggests the strength of a narrative that has a hold on the collective imagination. So the narrative of the grand dérangement in this case. And more explicit still, in my opinion, is what's highlighted in green. So while it's likely that Prospero and Miranda would be exiled by sea, Maillet clearly emphasizes the mode of transportation, the ship with the verb embarquer, which in French means to embark. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word hurried has connotations of transportation, but none that relates to the sea. And more significantly, and in my opinion, more importantly, Maillet's embarquer finds echo in narratives of Acadie, but not in Québécois translations. So you can see, first I'll mention that the grand dérangement is also euphemistically referred to as l'embarquement or the embarkment by some historians. So there's a clear link with that word in Maillet. And column D shows why. This is an excerpt from the diary of John Winslow, the British official responsible from the deportation at Grand Pré, and you can see that he uses the word as well. And then in columns B and C are two examples by Québécois translators. So Michel Garneau and Normand Chauret, they both use the word entraîner, which means to carry or drag. And then in column E, I put Evangeline back just for good measure. She pops up again in, this is an excerpt from Longfellow's poem. And you can see here that he too uses the word embarking a couple of times. And it's perhaps not surprising because I'll mention that he did consult Winslow's diary while he was writing his poem. But what we see here is that Maillet was taking advantage of historical fact to add in her translation the image of a ship and to create a sense of tacit complicity between text and Acadian reader or theater goer. So what happens 3 decades later? I mentioned 2 translations from 2020, so from last year, and the first I'll talk about is Sonia Malabalza's La Coucheuse de Scots Bay. She dedicates a good portion of her 4-page translator's note to explaining her strategy for rendering the multiple songs of the source text. And she explains that this was especially important to her given the author's musicology training. So she explains that she researched and incorporated songs from the Franco-Canadian repertoire that she felt would render the spirit of their English counterparts. Not all the songs are Acadian, as Malabalza makes clear in the use of the qualifier Franco-Canadian, as opposed to Acadian or even French-Canadian, which would have other connotations. But what I keep coming back to is that she would have had other options. One of them is that the novel is set in Nova Scotia, in a primarily Anglophone region, so it would have been completely plausible for her to keep the songs in their original English. Or she could have translated the lyrics herself, but her decision to substitute speaks to an impulse similar to Maillet's in that it gives voice to the French experience in a region historically fraught with linguistic and colonial tensions. And I've also found that in her translation, in addition to recreating the soundscape through songs, Malaboza plays with the landscape as well. The novel has a lot of botanical references for medicines and herbs used by the novel's midwives. And she explains that she relied primarily on the reference book Médecine traditionnelle en Acadie, or Traditional Medicines of Acadie, in her translation to substitute plants whose names didn't carry what she calls the symbolic charge, the same symbolic charge in English as, in French, as in English. And so on the screen, I provide an excerpt from The Midwife's Garden, included at the end of the book to show what happens. You can see that in some of the cases, she kept, so highlighted in green in this case is her keeping the, translating the English for the French. So Guémon is the French translation of kelp, and she did classify it under G. But in other cases, she deliberately changes the plant, even if the French translation started with the same letter as the English. So you can see in pink, we have fennel, which in French is fenouil, so it should be under F, but she put a fraisier instead. And hyssop is hyssop in French, also starts with an H, and she used houblon or hop in this case. So in my opinion, she symbolically replaces the Nova Scotian flora with an Acadian flora, and thereby effectively re-landscapes the territory in a metaphorical reversal of the Grand Dérangement that raised the land of its Francophone inhabitants, as well as their houses, farms, and livestock. And as a further addition to that, you can also see on the screen the French translation, the cover for the French translation compared to the English. It's a cover designed by artist Carole Deveau, who is Acadian, and she's also a forager and a herbalist. But you can clearly see the difference between the two covers, and that very important emphasis being put on flora and on the landscape in the French translation. And the second translation that I wanted to talk about is Jojet Leblanc's Océan. Jojet Leblanc is from the Baie-Sainte-Marie region in Nova Scotia. It's the same region where the first Acadian settlers established their community in 1604. And it's where Jojet developed her poetic practice, which she grounds in Acadian. It's an Acadian French dialect exclusive to that very small region of Nova Scotia. And the source text is Sugoyet's poetry collection, Ocean. It's described as a biography of the ocean, specifically as she experiences it at the foot of the city of Halifax, some 265 kilometers east of Baie-Sainte-Marie. But both the Bay and Halifax, and by extension, both author and translator, experience the fog, waves, tides, tragedies, and relationships with the same ocean of the text, and that's the Atlantic Ocean. Still, what I want to get at here is that Leblanc explicitly attributes her choice of Acadian as her translation language to her lived experience in Baie-Sainte-Marie. You can see from her quote here, the language of translation had to live within me. Having grown up in Nova Scotia near the Atlantic coast, it was normal that Océan speak the French of the area and that it express itself in Acadian French that continues to be spoken and in which I write. And readers seem to notice that strategy and that its work. The jury that awarded Océan the 2020 Governor General's Literary Award for Translation wrote that the poems in this collection resonate with the waves that crash against the Acadian coast at Baie-Sainte-Marie. Upon reading this luminous epic, each and every person will hear the foghorn in the distance and will taste the brine on the breeze. So like other varieties of Acadian French, Acadian maintains close ties to the French that colonists brought with them 4 centuries ago. Antonine Maillet herself talks a lot about this in her own work, and sociolinguistic research into Acadian reveals a feeling of authenticity and legitimacy tied to this. But by using that language, Leblanc is able to carve out an expression of Acadian identity from within the confines of the source text. She's expressly stated that her aim wasn't to rewrite or transform or comment on Goyette's Ocean, but instead she's able to create a connection with her ancestors through language. And you can see here what I mean. I've provided Jojet Leblanc's Acadian translation. This is from poem 18 of Ocean. But there's the Acadian version. There's my translation into a so-called standard or referential French, right? If any of you are able to read French. And then there's Sue Goyette's source text. But I've highlighted grammatical particularities in pink, phonetic spelling in bright green, Acadian vocabulary in yellow, and one English word highlighted in turquoise. And these are all characteristics of Acadian. And through this language, Leblanc incorporates the Acadian experience of the ocean in her translation. The source text already speaks to the tremendous losses generally associated with living by the ocean. But by doing so in Acadian, Leblanc links the text inextricably back to the Acadian experience of the deportation as it occurred in the area of the Baie Sainte-Marie. And I'll draw your attention to the text written in blue. The text's empty promises in Leblanc's translation speak to the broken promises that British officials made to neutral Acadians in the years leading up to the Grand Dérangement. She's not changing the source text, but an Acadian reader can pick up on these things. And the eyes that keep watching are those of the ancestors who remain alive in the collective memory, and that the eyes of their tears continue to watch in English, because the word watch is written in English in the French or in the Acadian text, further nuances the Acadian condition of linguistic minority. So what does this all mean for translation and minority translation specifically going forward? I think it's clear from these few and very specific examples that the weaving in of Acadian identity through translation continues from the foundations laid by Maillet into present day translations, both in practice and in the translator's conception of their work. While Maillet creates a sense of complicity with her Acadian readers on a Québécois stage, we can read Malabalza's recreation of the sound and landscapes as fostering a sense of regeneration and renewal. This idea, although I didn't delve into it today, is further reinforced by the casting of midwives as opposed to the Virgin Evangeline in the novel's storyline. And Jojet Leblanc, for her part, reclaims the Atlantic Ocean for the Acadian ancestors who perished in it. She positions the tears that her ancestors shed into the ocean in the motion of the waves, so that they're continuously coming back and in some kind of movement, which again is a clear contrast to Evangeline and her immutable tears. Longfellow's Evangeline left Acadie never to return, but in Leblanc's narrative, the Acadians symbolically come back with the rhythms of the sea, and it also signals replenishment and regeneration. So yes, Malabalza and Leblanc engage in strategies similar to those I've previously identified in Maillet, but are they perpetuating or contesting or addressing the stagnant and monolithic identity myths, particularly those surrounding Evangeline? And it might seem from my very specific and historical weaving in of Acadian identity and with my constant references to Evangeline, that these translations are perpetuating those myths. But it seems clear to me that Malabalza and Leblanc, along with Maillet, are playing with and within this identity. And I think this is where Nicole Nolette's concept of traduction ludique, or playful translation, can become useful, because it also allows us to arrive at conclusions of plurality, to a both and situation rather than an either or dichotomy. In Nolette, accommodation it's a strategy, and it doesn't equate to capitulation anyway. Playfulness in her terms allows for multiplicity. It allows for jeu or play and enjeu or issue to become intertwined in translation, and for identity and post-identity to coexist. So the metonymic inscription of multi-layered meaning in these translations create a sort of complicity between the text and their Acadian readers. To me, it means that the translations are operating in a system in which translation drives the possibility of bypassing the restrictiveness of minority identity logic. They promote a complex and multi-layered approach to identity, one that is embedded in playful configurations of language and imagery, and that inherently complicate the monolithic myths of identity. So in other words, translation supports a modern and plural conception of Acadian identity that in turn allows us to consider minority translation in French Canada beyond the doxological or nationalistic functions that have so far been favored and that have been explained quite extensively by Annie Brisset. It also breaks down the binary between two modern conceptions of Acadian identity, the genealogical vision that projects cultural identity based on language and self-association, and the territorial vision that's defined operationally and geographically. And this is where I think it gets particularly exciting when we start to think about minority translation today and in the future, especially when we consider the fact that Acadie is a dual minority to both Francophone Québec and English Canada. The possibility of bridging modern conceptions of identity, or having our cake and eating it too, as it were, adds to the dynamics and motivations to bypass restrictive interpretations and logic. To be sure, the limits of this short overview are multifold, not least because the analysis comprises a narrow sample of works, but I still think that the conclusions are indicative of a tendency rooted in the still unexplored potential and history of Acadie as a space for translation. And I think that this means that Acadian speech or narrative has both the potential and the opportunity to traverser or to travel in various guises in translation going forward. I'd be happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, Danielle, for this wonderful talk, which is a great conclusion, I think, for the conference also.